Welcome, everyone, to Wild World Lore, a channel dedicated to bringing you stories that have sparked our interest. Some real, and others not so real, but all less known and even lesser shared. Today, we'll be diving into a conflict you'd expect to see in a Hollywood blockbuster, the Madman's War. Now, I know what you're thinking. Madman's War even sounds like a bad boo movie. But stick around, because this story has so much going for it. Colonial oppression, a mystical warrior prophet who claimed he could talk to heaven, a sister who deflected bullets with a magic flag, homemade flintlock rifles, and even a cannon made out of a tree trunk that only one guy in the village could lift. It all started in the mountains of French Indochina between 1918 and 1921. Alright, so let's start at the beginning. It's the early 1900s, and France has a firm grip on Indochina, what we now know as Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. The Hmong people were living in the mountainous regions, practicing slash and burn agriculture, cutting timber, and, well, growing opium, which was normal around that time. Incidentally, the opium bit is important because the French colonial government knew that poppy fields were incredibly profitable. As far as the actual politics went, though, things got a bit more messy. The French didn't directly run everything. They used local Lao and Thai officials as tax collectors. And these tax collectors, well, let's just say they were a bit creative with their collection methods. They'd show up to the same village multiple times, claiming taxes were due again and again. Oh, you paid already? Well, here's another tax. They'd steal cattle, take horses, and sometimes they'd just confiscate the entire opium harvest. Imagine working all year and having some bureaucrat roll up and take everything you've worked for. The Hmong were getting squeezed from every direction, living on marginal land in the highlands, dependent on their cash crops, and being exploited by middlemen who treated them like they were disposable. By 1918, tensions were at a breaking point. People were angry, desperate, and looking for somebody to lead them out of this nightmare. That tension brings us to Pache View, or just Pache, also known as Bachai. This guy's origin story is really nothing too out of the ordinary for those times. He was an orphan, raised by his uncle in Lao Cai province in northern Vietnam. By all accounts, he was a charismatic guy, but lived a pretty normal life, got married, even had a kid. But then something changed. Pache started claiming he was having divine visions. He said that God, or the ancestral spirits, depending on who's telling you the story, had called him to lead the Hmong people to freedom and prosperity. Now, you might be thinking, yeah, okay, another guy claiming to talk to God. We've heard that story at least a few times now. But the thing is, Pache backed it up with what people at the time considered proof. It was claimed that he performed wild feats that convinced people he had supernatural powers. Stories talk about him jumping onto the roof of a house in a single bound, or making a ball of cotton explode. Basically, all things that seemed impossible. But most notably, he claimed he could receive military orders directly from heaven. In order to do this, he'd literally climb trees to commune with the divine and get his battle plans. Whether you personally believe in these supernatural acts or not, what matters is that the Hmong people at the time did. They were living under brutal oppression, and here was someone offering them hope, backed by what seemed like divine authority. Pache's movement started to snowball. People from northern Laos, northern Vietnam, and even parts of southern China joined his cause. Other oppressed minorities, the Khmu and Mab Dom peoples, also rallied to this banner. By mid-1918, things really took off in earnest. Hmong groups had been clashing with the Lao and Thai officials who were enforcing the colonial taxes, but in October 1918, Pache made a much bolder move. About 300 warriors under his command raided villages near Dien Bien Phu. Yeah, the same place that would become famous decades later for a massive French loss during the First Indochina War. They burned hamlets and killed local chiefs who were collaborating with the French. Then, on December 5th, 1918, they ambushed a French outpost. That was the moment it stopped being a local tax dispute and became a full-blown insurgency against colonial rule. France knew it had to start taking this rebellion seriously, but was still tied up in World War I, and so reinforcements and firepower were slow to arrive. Pache later declared himself king and announced Hmong independence from French Indochina entirely. Now, one thing that made this rebellion so fascinating from a military standpoint is that it was almost entirely self-sustaining. The Hmong weren't getting their weapons from outside powers or foreign supporters. They designed and manufactured their own. Whether it was flintlock rifles, slightly different from European flintlocks, but effective enough, or the Hmong cannon, made of a hollowed out tree trunk and packed with gunpowder and loaded with metal pot pieces. They even made their own gunpowder, using charcoal, guano, and potassium nitrate. This was almost like a sort of DIY revolution. And at its peak, the rebellion controlled about 40,000 square kilometers of territory, stretching from Dien Bien Phu in the north down to areas near Vientiane and across to Sam Nua in Laos. That's a massive chunk of mountainous terrain. Okay, now to get to the really wild part, and my personal favorite, the psychological warfare and stories that terrified the French soldiers, leading to them referring to this war as Guerre de Fou, or War of the Insane. The French army was chasing Pache's forces through these brutal mountain passes and ravines, and they noticed something strange. They never saw any dead Hmong soldiers, not a single body. This was definitely disconcerting to them, because people had to be dying in these battles. Rumors started spreading through the French ranks that Pache's army was protected by magic, that they were literally invincible. The truth tells a far different story. Pache had given his men strict orders: never leave anyone behind, and cover up blood as quickly as possible. So the French would show up after a firefight and see nothing. No evidence anyone under Pache's command had died. It created an illusion of invulnerability that was incredibly effective at demoralizing the enemy. And then there's some of the other key people in the rebellion. Cao Mi, Pache's sister, was said to carry a white flag made of hemp. According to the stories, she used it to deflect bullets, with the explanation given that she was a righteous virgin, so the heavens had granted her miraculous powers. Or the nun, Pa Kiao, who was able to sit on banana leaves and turn beans into soldiers. While we do know that Cao Mi did apparently lead troops into many successful battles, whether you believe the other stories were literal truth, exaggeration, or propaganda, the belief in them were enough to inspire many warriors to fight alongside the rebellion. But here's the harsh reality about rebellions against colonial powers. They're incredibly hard to sustain, especially when your own people are divided. Not all Hmong supported Pache. The French had made some clever moves. They'd incorporated some Hmong chiefs into colonial administration, giving them status and power in exchange for loyalty. So you had Hmong fighting on both sides. These chiefs, along with reinforcements and firepower able to be sent in now that World War I had subsided, did a great deal to turn the tide in their favor. By early 1920, things started falling apart for the rebels. Many village leaders switched sides or had stayed loyal to the French. French columns, often guided by Hmong loyalists who knew the terrain, started recovering control of the territory. Rebel units got intercepted and raided. Key insurgent leaders were arrested. The movement that had seemed unstoppable just a year earlier was crumbling. By spring 1920, the surviving rebels were disarmed. They went back to paying colonial taxes, with additional massive reparation payments on top of the regular taxes the French later added on. In 1921, it was coming to a close. Pache fled into the jungle with just a handful of followers. By March, French officials announced the collective submission of the last rebel groups. The highlands were declared fully pacified, and this war was finally and officially over. And the fate of Pache? The French killed him, and then to send a message, they displayed a photograph of his severed head to the Hmong population as a warning. It was designed to make absolutely clear that the rebellion was over, and that any further defiance would be crushed. But the thing about martyrs is, killing them doesn't always end their influence. Today, Pache is considered a national hero by the Hmong people. There's even a small red flower called Pache's grass, Nraj Paj Kai in Hmong, that blooms every December and January. The story goes that it first appeared after his death and was named in his honor. The rebellion also forced some changes in local politics. The French granted the Hmong special status in 1920, though whether this was genuine reform or just a way to pacify the population is debatable. What's undeniable is that the Madman's War showed that the Hmong were willing to fight and die for their freedom, even against overwhelming odds. The legacy of this conflict echoes through Hmong history. Decades later, during the Vietnam War, Hmong fighters would again take up arms, and the memory of Pa Che and his rebellion remained a symbol of resistance and ethnic pride. So there you have it, the Madman's War, a 3-year rebellion that the French tried to dismiss as the ravings of a lunatic, but which was ultimately a legitimate anti-colonial uprising by an oppressed people who'd had enough. Pa Che wasn't crazy. He was desperate, charismatic, and willing to fight against impossible odds for his people's freedom, and that willingness earned him a permanent spot in history. If you enjoyed this deep dive into lesser known history, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories like this. Drop a comment and let me know what your thoughts were on this story, or if there's another story you'd love to hear me cover. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.